Hi, I'm Mitchell from DPReview. Earlier this year, Sony released the ZV-E10 II, the latest iteration of its APS-C interchangeable lens vlogging camera. We've now been able to fully put it to the test and have found that it's extremely capable, though it does have some notably absent features. Let's take a look. The ZV-E10 II uses a 26 megapixel sensor and can shoot 4K video at up to 60 frames per second, albeit with a very slight crop. In 1080p, it can shoot it up to 120 frames per second for some pretty nice slow motion. On the top, there's a 3-capsule microphone, which can automatically decide whether it should capture sound from in front of the camera, behind it, or all around it. Also, this camera comes with a handy little wind cover for the microphone, which is a really smart addition. Of course, if we really want to get a feel for what this camera is capable of, we should probably actually shoot some footage on it. So give me one moment. Okay, I'm now filming with the ZV-E10 II and the rest of the video will be shot with it unless otherwise noted. One thing I really like about this camera is how approachable Sony's made it for beginner videographers who are maybe just getting into vlogging or who haven't owned a dedicated camera before. It has this intelligent auto mode that deals with all the settings for you based on what you're trying to shoot, and you can upload LUTs or lookup tables to it so your video has the colors you want straight out of camera. There's also this Cinevlog mode that will automatically switch to the Cinetone color profile and add black bars to the top and bottom of your video to mimic a cinematic aspect ratio. Then there's the product showcase mode, which makes sure the autofocus system doesn't stay stuck on your face when you're clearly holding something up to show the audience. With that said, you do have to remember to turn it on before you start recording. That is, by the way, indicative of how well the subject tracking autofocus works. It's good enough that Sony had to add a feature to override it in certain situations. It can recognize humans, animals, and birds, though it hasn't been trained on insects, planes, trains, or automobiles like some of the systems on Sony's other cameras. That means if you're shooting any of those things or any other subjects that the camera isn't trained on, you'll have to use the standard autofocus tracking mode, which is still good, but decidedly less reliable. This camera also has a background defocus button, which lets you decide whether you want the background to be blurred out or relatively sharp. That sounds great if you want to get a cinematic look, but there's a bit of an issue that can crop up depending on what mode you're using, and it's simply because of the physics of how cameras work. The defocus button basically just opens up the aperture, which does provide that blurry depth of field look, but it also lets in more light. If you're shooting in bright sunshine, like I am now, the camera will have to raise the shutter speed to compensate for that, since it doesn't have any sort of built-in ND filter to darken the image. Video tends to look a little strange if you're using a shutter speed that's too fast, so pressing the defocus button can make any motion in your footage look really sharp and staccato-y.
Now, that shouldn't be too much of an issue if you're shooting indoors, as the camera will probably be able to use a more sensible shutter speed and raise the ISO setting to make up for the lack of light, letting it account for your background defocus selection. You also shouldn't run into that problem if you're using the clear background defocus mode, which tries to make the background less blurry by stopping down the aperture.
Another thing this camera doesn't have is a stabilized sensor, which could help reduce some of the roll, shake, and jitter from hand holding it. It does have electronic image stabilization, but that crops in on the frame, giving you a tighter shot. I also don't necessarily love what it does with motion. If you're just trying to take a static shot without a tripod, or doing a simple movement like a pan, it may be okay, but for walking and talking to the camera, it can give the footage a weird jitteriness that I find quite distracting. Using a lens with optical image stabilization, like the kit lens, can help, but overall, I find it kind of difficult to get pleasing handheld footage using this camera. Another thing the ZV-E10 II lacks is the auto-framing feature from some of Sony's other ZV series cameras. That would usually allow it to crop in a subject and follow them around, kind of like a real camera person would. However, if you put this camera up on a tripod, you're just going to get a static shot. Okay, I know I've listed a lot of shortcomings with this camera, but really whether any of them should concern you depends a lot on what your definition of vlogging is. Now, when I hear that word, I think of skateboarding through a city, holding a camera on a gorilla pod, and just sharing clips from your everyday life. But if that's the type of video you want to make, I'm just really not sure this is the camera for you, mostly because of the stabilization situation. Now, you could always throw it on a gimbal, but by the time you've gotten one of those, you might as well have just gotten a camera with a stabilized sensor to begin with. That could be something like the Sony a6700, which is essentially just the souped up ZV-E10 II, but with a stabilized sensor and a host of other features.
But also, I don't really know if that's what vlogging is anymore. These days, a lot of vlogs are people sitting in their well-lit offices talking to the camera, like I'm doing now. Sure, there may be some shots taken outside, or even walk and talk sections, but those usually aren't the bulk of what they're filming. And if that's the kind of video that you want to make, it's kind of hard to imagine that you need much more than the ZV-E10 II. The autofocus is still some of the best around, and there's a lot of good lenses available for it from Sony and third parties like Sigma. It also just kind of nails the basics. It uses a bigger battery than its predecessor, which lasted quite a while in my testing, and its rolling shutter performance is quite good, although it does fall just short of excellent when you're shooting 4K. I also didn't experience any real-world issues with overheating, even when shooting at 4K 60p at max quality. You may have some problems if you're trying to take longer, high frame rate videos on a hot sunny day, but outside of that scenario, I wouldn't really worry about it too much.
Why do I feel like I'm forgetting something? Oh, right, this camera is also pretty okay for shooting stills. If you're taking a ton of pictures, you'll probably find yourself missing an electronic viewfinder, second control dial, and especially a mechanical shutter. But if you're just taking the occasional photo and can take your time with it, you can get great results. It even shoots lossless RAW if you really want to get in there and edit your photos. I don't get the sense that Sony just tacked on a picture mode like I tacked on this section. But that's not to say that you should buy this camera with the intent of shooting stills. Like really, it's a vlogging camera, just consider the photo mode a bonus. Okay, I think that about wraps it up for this review. I'd love to hear what you think about the ZV-E10 II. Do you think Sony gave up too much when making this camera, or that it made just the right trade-offs? And also, while you're in the comments, feel free to leave any questions you may have. Drop us a like if this video is helpful, and subscribe if you want to keep up to date with the latest in camera tech. I'll see you at DPReview.com. The first wipeout on camera.